Mason and Hamlin is one of the great American piano companies, but one that has a long history of ups and downs. Henry Mason and Lowell Hamlin started Mason and Hamlin in 1854 as a melodeon manufacturer. By the 1870s, they employed up to 500 workers and were producing almost 200 reed organs a week. It was in 1883, though, that they began building their first pianos. In 1895, the German piano scale designer Richard Goertz reorganized the Mason and Hamlin piano department and subsequently introduced one of his most recognized inventions, the tension resonator. It's kind of like the Steinway bell, but on steroids. Its sole purpose is to keep the rim from expanding over time, which would let the crown of the soundboard flatten out, and it would kill the tone. It really works, too. In 1904, Mason and Hamlin was purchased by the Cable Company, and the next 20 years became the golden era of Mason and Hamlin pianos. The pianos made in this era are actually still sought after even today. By 1924, though, Mason and Hamlin had been sold and would be sold again and again over the coming decades. It would take until the 1990s for Mason and Hamlin to get back to the kind of piano building it did in their earlier years. Today, Mason and Hamlin is owned by Kirk Burgett and Burgett Inc., which also owns Piano Disc Systems. Burgett is continuing the Mason and Hamlin penchant for innovation with the continued use of the tension resonator in all of its models, the introduction of carbon fiber action parts, and even soundboard transducers for its player piano models. The harps in Mason and Hamlin pianos tend to be quite different from other brands. This one has a sloping string layout where the strings slope lower towards the tenor break by about 1/4 of an inch. The hammer line then has to have the same slope. Don't lose these old screws. They're impossible to replace. These are pretty typical 1970s hammers. They have a green coloring and a teardrop shape instead of the more modern diamond or fully rounded style that's common now. These old capstans are interesting too. They're borrowed from the upright pianos of the same era. They're fine, except that when they need to be polished, the polishing compound gets into all the little corners and it's impossible to clean them out. This action has one of the worst inventions I've ever seen in an action design. It's those tiny little cotton strings holding the repetition springs in place. When they get old, they all start breaking and the keys start failing left and right. Ugh, hate them. The underlevers are interesting. They're similar to modern adjustable levers, except they have a regulation button instead of a capstan to adjust the height for the sostenuto tab. Something that's not a Mason and Hamlin feature is the tin-foiled pin block. There's a lot of ingenuity in the piano business, and this certainly qualifies. I have to assume the piano used to have a dehumidifier rod inside the action cavity, and the tinfoil was installed to shield the pin block from the heat. Upon listening to the tone and feeling the action, it's obvious that this piano has more sound to give, and that the regulation is really hindering both the playability and the sound. I spot all the usual culprits. The hammer line's too low, there's not enough key travel because of that to finish the sequence, and so the action feels really stiff. The repetition strings are slow and inconsistent, the drop is deep. It was probably set deeper by someone in the past to avoid the dreaded bobbling hammer issue. The hammer rest rail is now set too high for this hammer height. That tells me that the factory hammer height spec was higher than what I've set. The difference is most likely just from the felt and paper punchings under the keys compressing over the years. You want about 1/4 inch of clearance below the hammer shank. Make sure not to lower it so much that it pinches the top of the whipping flange. There's a loose hammer head. You can usually hear it tick when you play the note. There's a special tool for taking hammers off, but you can also do it by hand. This wood is more than 50 years old, so you have to be careful not to split the hammer shank. The proper glue-up technique is to apply glue to both the inside of the board hole and the shank, and then you spin the hammer to create a nice collar. Titebond tends to shrink, so the collars don't look as good and robust as the modern factory glue, which is usually a white PVA glue. I'm adjusting the back checks up to catch the hammers higher. The backcheck wire here is old enough that it's become soft and bendable, which is nice for adjustments, but it's not very stable. The wood in the key surrounding the wire is also brittle, so setting the backchecks can be finicky. So after this, I've done everything I really needed to do, did a tuning, so let's take a listen.